destination. Most people would view prison as the destination, but they would view prison as the obstacle, but Paul was yet viewing it as his destination. You see, sometimes, I don't think I would ever think back to a time where I viewed a rough situation as a destination. See, Paul knew that God had him there for a reason, and he lived in that. And let's look at some more of this, and we'll see why. Verse 13, so that my bonds in Christ are manifest in all the palace and in all other places. In all other places. See, Paul gets thrown in prison, and the first thing he probably does is he starts fellowshipping with his brothers in Christ who are also thrown in prison at Rome. And they're there encouraging one another, and there's other people around them listening, people that are lost, people that aren't saved. And Paul and probably his friends in Christ, they start immediately drilling into these people and giving them a hope that they don't have. See, in prison, usually that's where you die back then. You go into prison, that's where you're going to die. Your life is the same thing every day. It's purposeless. But Christianity is something we have as a hope that most people don't have. And that's what Paul and his brothers in Christ are trying to communicate with the people also in prison. But not only that, while they're trying to preach to the lost people, here's the guards listening to the overflow of this ministry. Here's the people of Rome who their goal is to shut Christianity out, are now being overflowed with the gospel of Christ. And they're seeing that these group of people now have a hope in prison that doesn't make sense. Like, why are these people so joyful whenever they're in prison and their life's going to end? Why do they have this hope? And it's one answer, Jesus Christ. They knew that this life wasn't permanent. You know, Miss Otto yesterday we had her funeral. Her life wasn't permanent. She lived for Christ. This place wasn't her home. Heaven was her home, and she just made it home. She doesn't have Alzheimer's anymore. She's healed. She's with Jesus Christ. And that's what these people had. They had the hope past this life, and they completely comprehended that and believed that. Not only did they do that, though, they lived it out. And they weren't quiet about it either. They weren't ashamed. They went around and they profoundly claimed what they believed. And here's the guards, and they're listening, and I can already see, their lives are starting to change. And how do I know their lives changed? Let's just skip to Philippians at the end of the book, chapter 4, verse 22. This is at the very conclusion of the letter here. He says, all the saints salute you, chiefly they that are of Caesar's household. What does that tell me? That means that the chiefs of Caesar's household, the gospel has made it all the way up there. The very people whose goal is to persecute Christianity are now becoming Christians, all because some people were faithful in their rough situations and their rough times. And I wonder, here today, in your past rough situations, in your hard times, are you viewing that as an opportunity or an obstacle? Are you proclaiming Christ just as much in your rough situation as your good situations in life? Are you willing to take the good with the bad? Because without the bad in life, what's good, How can you celebrate what's good if you don't know what's bad? That's how we got to look at it, and that's the attitude that Paul looked at it with. How much different could our lives be if we look at our rough situations from a godly perspective like Paul did? His rough situation wasn't just his final destination. That was his destination on earth, and that's what he fully believed. But he knew his destination was heaven, so he didn't care where he was on earth. But as long as he was on earth, he was going to proclaim the name of Christ. I like to give this example like a tow truck. So just imagine you're in a car or a truck, and you're driving your kids to school. You're driving down the road, and all of a sudden your drive shaft snaps. And you have to call a tow truck. You can't get your kids to school, and you have this rough, bad attitude towards life in the moment. You're not there financially to fix your situation. The kids, you're barely having enough money to put food on the table, and now you're figuring out how to get the kids to school, and you're just mumbling and grumbling. The tow truck man comes alongside of you. He's like, yeah, I've been in this situation multiple times before. It stinks, doesn't it? And you're just there mumbling, grumbling, and the rest of your day is miserable. Well, how much differently would we be able to look at our lives differently, So say we're driving down the road and our drive shaft snaps. And instead of taking the kids to school, you can't do that anymore, but guess what? You have friends that you can call that will take your kids to school for you. God has given you those friends, so you thank God for them friends. And then you see the tow truck man coming down the road, and you already have it purposed in your heart that you're going to share Christ with that man. That man has to tow your car, and that's not a little process. He has to be there for 10 minutes at least. So that is 10 minutes that this tow truck man has to forcefully listen to you preach the gospel. What if we viewed it from that perspective? What if we what if we did that? Why don't we do that? Why don't we think of everything as an opportunity but an obstacle in our lives? It'd be completely different in our lives if we lived that way. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Point number 2. It's not in the motive, it's in the message. It's not in the motive, it's in the message. Let's look here at verse 15. Some indeed preach Christ, even of envy and strife, and some also of good will. The one preached Christ of contention, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my bonds, but the other of love, knowing that I am set for the defense of the gospel. What then, notwithstanding every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached? And I therein do rejoice, yea, and will rejoice. What is happening here? What's the context of this? Paul is receiving outside information from his buddies around him. And what his buddies are telling him is like, look, people are using your rough situation for their glory. They're using your imprisonment to lift them up and their ministries up. They're taking advantage of you and where you're at in order to build a name for themselves. And I think that's interesting here. And Paul, how does he respond